Hi, are you all able to listen to me? Is my audio clear? Aman,
Yes, Pavna.
I hear you good.
thanks. So we welcome you all to DBP's monthly webinar series. Today is the second one in the row, and today we have Chris Lambert, the CEO of Kudosi. He'll be talking to us about data being a window to the software. I see some of you have registered with us for the first time, so before I leave the floor off to Chris, I would like to give a brief intro about who we are and what we do. So we help our clients improve their business performance and productivity by implementing and optimizing the solutions using their data. We work at the intersection of data and technology. At the foundation of all this, we adhere to our core principles of simplicity, passion, integrity, commitment, and excellence, shortly acronymed as SPICE values. Our consulting services are mainly categorized into three that, like as you see here, that's digital services, data services, and analytics services. We have three reasons for you to hire us. That's three E's as you see here. We offer decades of expertise in identifying key problems and solving them. We focus on solutions that maximize return on invested capital for our clients. We thrive towards excellence to innovate and lower the cost while creating a high value. For any questions or queries, I'll be sharing our contact IDs, email IDs later via email after this webinar, so you may contact us. We also have more speakers lined up for the following months. In June, we had Prashant's webinar on data being an asset and not being on balance sheet. Today we have Chris Lambert. In August, we have Aarti Joshi and Prashant Sautikal speaking on smart data engineering. And then we have Laurie Silverman, Mark Stern, and a few more speakers lined up for the following months. So stay tuned. So before so thank you everyone for your attention. Chris, now I hand over to you.
All right, thank you. Hey folks, hope everybody's staying healthy in these times. I know it's definitely been challenging, but we'll persevere, I'm sure. I'm gonna share my screen and bump into presentation mode. Can everybody see this okay? Does the slide come up fine?
Yes, Chris, it's good.
All right, well, actually I had a discussion with Prashant and you know, in that discussion, we were talking about some of the systems that we've been working on, in this case with Payload, and I made the comment to him because we're looking at the analytics and how to apply ML and AI to our product, and where do we go next, right? And how do we tackle that journey? And I made the comment to him that, well, when you're looking at a software application, often data can be a window into that application, right? It can tell you a great deal about how that application functions, what the latent opportunities are within that application, and a lot more. And Prashant really liked that. We dove into it a bit and we said, why don't we just do a talk and share this kind of knowledge and this information, because this is really critical. It's especially critical for companies seeking competitive advantage and for trying to get ahead in the marketplace when it's particularly competitive. Because we tend to fixate on the applications themselves as opposed to what the value those applications have to the customer or what they can bring to the customer, right? So a little bit about myself. Who am I? Why do you care? So my experience, I have over 20+ years of product and software development experience, about 8 years of leadership experience. Really what motivates me as an individual is the challenge of solving problems with technology. That's always been a prime motivator for me. And that's why I'm here to talk to you today, is I really want to focus on how can I help other folks that have been in scenarios that I've found myself in over the years to circumnavigate a lot of these challenges and do so in a cost-effective way. So in one life, I'm a CTO at Payload, and the Chief Technology Officer at Payload. And in another, I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Kudosi Software. And so I'll talk a little bit about those as we progress through this journey here and this discussion. But let's get to the meat of the matter. And to really dive into the statement, data can be a window into the application, we first need to lay some framework, some foundation upon which we can have this discussion. We need to agree on a few terms and agree on a few things. So I'm going to dedicate the next slide to that endeavor. And that really is talking about what is the anatomy of an application. When we talk about a software product, be it HubSpot or Salesforce or whatever, what's that comprised of? What do we mean? And so for the purpose of this discussion, I think of the anatomy of an application as really three key pieces. And mind you, depending who you speak to, there can be more or less, right? But for this discussion, we'll keep it simple and we'll say the three key components of any application really come down to the interface. And that's often represented through a graphical interface to the user, but not necessarily. It can be a hardware type interface. It can be a batch job running that integrates into an application, has system logs through which you'd monitor it. But it's some portion of the app through which humans are able to actually interface with the application to determine if it's functioning or producing the appropriate outputs. So the second piece is a set of functions. And so that's really what we traditionally think of as the application itself, right? So the functions are what makes this program work? What's the special sauce or the IP hidden within that makes this application of value to folks, or at least is the cornerstone, the bedrock of that value. And that's usually figured out, or that's usually comprising of things like, in today's world, web services, though in the past it's also often been middleware components and a lot of the code itself, right? So it's the function of the app, it's the soul of the app, if you will. And then we have something called data. And in the past, traditionally, data has really been perceived as an output. And one that often is hidden from the user except through one of the other two aspects of the app, the interface or the functions, right? So as an example, often data, if we capture data about a GPS coordinate capture, for instance, is a good example. How do we expose that information to the customer? And generally speaking, we do so by writing more application pieces to expose it. And it could be embedded reports or canned reports, as you'd call them, and whatnot. Some businesses get to a point where they have a BI person and they have someone who's able to build analytics and whatnot over top of it. That's certainly the trend in today's world. And so data really, though, forms the third point of this triangle. And collectively, we call that an application. So an application consists of the interface, the functions, and the data. So why are we here? What do we want to understand from this discussion? What can we drive to? And I think that the first section I would like to dive into is really coming down to, how do you understand your application from its data, right? Like what can we learn? And what does data tell us about that application? So data actually has a huge role. And when you really think about it, data is paramount to the functioning of an application in and of itself. You can't, well, you can, but it's an academic discussion about having an application that has no data, right? In real life, data underpins pretty much everything and is pivotal to the value of an application, both to the people entering the data, to the people collecting the data, and the people reporting on that data. All different facets of the or different personas, if you will, that interface with that application, they do so typically using data as the means to carry meaning from the use of that app. So we ask ourselves, what are the aspects of our application in terms of that data and processing, right? Like the data will help us understand which components are largely data centric and which components are mainly processing centric. And I'll explain a bit later on why this is important and what it can help us determine. So also we can start to look at how do users actually use our app. So there's this technique, and in my experience, it really became popular in the video game industry, where they would generate these heat maps, basically, right? And what they did is you'd have a level designer who would create this little fantasy world, if you will, right? And they'd have people go through and they would play test it. And what they would do is they'd gather all that data to say, wow, everybody seems to go to the fountain, right? But nobody goes to the little shop on the corner. No, like maybe 1 out of 20 people actually did that. But everybody, like, or almost everybody, 19 out of 20 people all went to the fountain. So based on that, in the game industry, they would actually take their 3D modelers and content creators, and they would spend more money on making that fountain really, really cool, really engrossing, because that's where people tended to go to. And so they're able to better focus their efforts in areas that matter and that have impact, or they're able to modify that level so that maybe you have to go through the shop to get to the fountain because maybe that's a key part of the story they're trying to tell, right? So data can actually tell us this information, and you don't actually need to use very complex systems right out of the gate. You can use your data directly to determine some of this. So other things that we want to talk about are looking at the data model. Is it overly complex, right? So is the data structured in a way that's amenable towards things like AI ML? Is it something that we have to do a lot of work to massage and flatten in order to pull out meaningful reports and whatnot, or is it something that lends itself well to this type of engagement? And the data, of course, is the place you want to look, and in particular, the data model or the data structure. You can also find fragility in a system. So where's the system weak, right? There's systems I've worked with in the past where they have they'll have a request to queue up a job or a service. And if the system doesn't have a way to store that request so that in the event of a failure, it can be replayed and reattempted, then you have a system that is very fragile. You can lose data, you can lose requests, right? The data itself can tell you this because the data structure, you'll be able to look at it and see, do we have queues, for instance, dead letter queues, these types of things. And if you don't have those, then you know that you have a potential issue there. And then finally, of course, one of the biggest things we can learn from data, which is I think probably the largest field of interest right now, is really data aggregation, and how can we take the data we've collected, all that raw data, and how can we aggregate it in such a way that the user gains value from that. And more importantly, to the company, you're often generating additional tier levels, you're generating net new products, stuff like that. And this can be extremely valuable. And as I said, many businesses are sprouting up all over that focus on this singular subject itself. So once we've kind of learned from that app, what can we do to improve it based on what we found out about the data? And so, we discussed earlier some of the points, and so I'll go back through them and say that, when we want to improve the performance of our system, we want to look at what components, what aspects of the system are under heavy load, are under heavy utilization, right? And so by looking at the data and understanding the data models and the complexity therein, we can often extrapolate, well, which areas could we simplify? Which areas could we flatten? Where could we create query optimizations, or build out query optimizations? Sometimes, and this has been my experience in the modern world, with cloud-based distributed data warehouses, you can often get massive performance gains just by switching your infrastructure. A good example for this was within Payload. We had a report that was taking somewhere around the 43-minute mark. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was over 40 minutes. And just by lifting that into Snowflake, into a data warehouse, a cloud-based data warehouse, we were able to bring that compute time all the way down to 7 to 9 seconds. So think about that, 40+ minutes down to, call it 10 seconds, if you will. It doesn't matter, that's orders of magnitude faster. And there was zero query optimization involved. It was simply moving to a different service. So that can be an option, but there's often cases where that's not an option, or using the cloud data warehouse can be really expensive because your queries are very unoptimized and use up egregious amounts of compute when they don't need to. So knowing the data and understanding that complexity and dealing with it by things like data warehousing and query optimization, stuff like that can be very valuable. You'll also want to look at what are the compute heavy services. So if you do have pieces of your application which interact with the data, but are largely performance bound based on the compute as opposed to the data itself, you probably want to look at starting to look to use things like microservices architectures, right? So, and microservices architectures really allow you to break up your app, if you will, and think of it as very mini little applications. So instead of having one big monolithic app, you break it down into little chunks. And the advantage of that is, let's say in your app, the login service is slammed and it's constantly falling over and it's having problems because everybody's using this service and it's just not meeting the performance. And so it impacts the performance of the whole system. So with microservices architecture, you can take and build out a little mini service that solely is responsible for handling that login piece. And then you can scale it up or down depending on the load, thereby saving cost, having pretty much infinite scalability, and eliminating the impact that it will have to all the services around it. So very powerful technique. So also in terms of what do we do next in terms of data, what else can we use it for? How can we use it to improve our app? We can do this through improving the user experience and performance of the app, because by better understanding the data, we can understand where the data is being changed and what the impact on that application is. So that's really key in enabling us to figure out those pieces and actually ensure that the user experience is helped through intelligent discovery of the data and finding out where things are often manipulated. You can also find opportunities often how to lay out your interface and change it just through the data alone, just through the relationship between the data alone. That's often very revealing, right? So a few other points I'll go through. You can often look at an application, and as we discussed with microservices, microservices are generally an approach that we use for compute-based segregation or separation of concerns, right? And that helps for compute-based reliability, scalability, and whatnot. But what do we do for data in terms of being able to handle massive loads of data without system failure and without fancy, expensive architectures? Well, it does require some work, obviously, but generally what we do is we look at you can take a monolithic app, even though it's not a microservice app, you can take one big app and you can find little gates throughout that app, and you can put queues in between each one. So say you had an interface where an employee submits a time off request, and then that time off request gets called right away. You could instead insert a queue between that, and now when they make that request, it goes into a queue. And then some other interface picks it up from the queue and carries on. And the advantage of that is if your system goes down or you have performance issues, then the people submitting it aren't getting blocked from doing it. They're able to keep submitting and everything's fine for them perceptually, right? And on the other side, as your system is coming back online or whatever's happening in the back end, as you resolve that, it just picks up where it left off and goes. So that's a way to really look at how you can support a system primarily through the data structure to ensure scalability. So really that all rolls together into, you know, the technical terms are really the microservices architecture and dead letter queues. Those can really help that eventual consistency, among other things. And understanding your data and how it's structured is pivotal in order to even start with this exercise. You must understand the data in order to understand how you can structure the data in such a way to leverage these techniques. So other things to think about is, and this is a good example with Kudosi, for instance. We had an example where a customer had some requests on how we handled the privacy of our goals. And so we were actually able to use the data itself, take our product team and our development team and our marketing team, put them together and basically say, okay, based on the data we have, here's how we store it. How do we give people better control over the visibility of goals within their organization and whatnot? Kudosi is a strategic planning tool, so that's why I'm talking about goals here. So in that case, we actually found a couple really good solutions, and it led to a very simple rule set. And that solution has been very successful for us. And that was all really due to just lifting the hood, pulling people together, and understanding how that data is structured and how we can use it going forward. And actually that didn't require any net new development outside of primarily user interface and some services in the back, but it didn't require a massive restructuring of the data. All right, so talked a little bit about identifying and resolving some issues. So how can we, this is the fun part, right? Like, how can we monetize this data? How do we get money out of this? And that's a great question, because pretty much everybody on the planet is looking at that question. So I would say that there's a few things you need to think about before you go down that path. First of all, it's a very good path. I would highly recommend it. If you store data, why just sit there with latent data chewing up money in your infrastructure? Why not actually leverage that data to the benefit not just of your company, but also to the people around you, the other companies around you, the other individuals around you, even people internally? There's a lot of information you can take out of existing data sets that will have value, a lot of value. You know, consider, for instance, if you're a big company, you hire 5,000, 6,000, or you
Okay, Chris, yeah, you may continue.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Somehow I lost internet access there. So let me just re-present, and we'll carry on. Okay, let's try this again. All right, sorry, we left off at monetizing. So, okay, so yes, there are a lot of opportunities to monetize the data, and I'm happy to discuss that with anyone. If you have any questions at the end, that'd be great stuff to discuss. So basically, there's a few things you want to do. First, you want to check your contracts and discuss with users what's going on, right? Like, make sure that you're open and ethical about it, right? There are certain laws in different states and provinces, depending where you live, and you should be aware of them. Generally speaking, in the Alberta space, for instance, we have requirement. I think it's at least 3 to 5. I think it's 3 or 5 companies need to be aggregated, say 5 to play it safe, before, and it can't reveal anything related to privacy, right? So as long as like using our example in the HR piece, if you wanted to utilize the data for folks, you could say, oh, what's the trend for what people find as the top 3 most challenging aspects about working at a company, and what can we do to improve? And you can probably glean that based on taking an aggregation of all the different employee reviews and doing some reporting on that, right? So there's a lot of value, a lot of opportunity there. But make sure you check and you make sure that what you're doing is ethical, right? So obviously, producing a report on people's credit card numbers is probably not a thing to do, right? Whether it's useful for internal or external usage. So secondly, yeah, and like I say, if you aggregate that data, typically you're in a good place, and it depends on the country and on the state. So just make sure you're aware of that. Once you've got past that, though, once you've gotten past the ethical and the legal aspects, and you make sure that you're good to go there, then you start to get into the fun. You start to identify the opportunities, and you really want to use both the raw data and the business domain to guide you. Oops, sorry. So, for instance, don't just rely primarily on what the business analyst says or the product guy or gal says. You want to take that knowledge. You want to take people's knowledge that use the data, so the systems analysts, the developers, stuff like that. Find these folks, you can pull them together, and you can have basically a mini hackathon, if you will, or just a mini theory crafting kind of session, right? Maybe you do a half-day retreat or something, and you just kind of put your heads together, and you'd be surprised with the stuff you can come up with. But what's even more interesting is often raw data itself is overlooked. So there's a lot of information in that raw data that can be used to help you glean a lot of opportunities for monetization. You just look at the data and start to imagine, right? Like a really good example, I think, is I was working with a company who they by necessity for their own safety rules and whatnot, they track things like weather information and stuff like that based on where they're at. That historical data could be used maybe to be aggregated in such a way that you can create a predictive model based on when do we see the most opportune times for shipping things across land versus water, things like that, right? So very, very good. Very good stuff, and there's a lot of opportunities in there, and include people that you wouldn't necessarily think are people that you'd want to include, because they often have different perspectives on the data that can really help inject a lot of ideation into that whole experience. So finally, the biggest one I think lately is this exploring the use of the data marketplace, right? So data marketplaces exist now. Snowflake is an example I use. It's one of my favorite cloud data warehouse products right now. They actually have a data marketplace, and basically what it is you can build and aggregate all this data, and then you can pump it up into Snowflake effectively, right? And you can resell that data on the marketplace. So you don't even have to resell it directly as a company, but you can gather all this information. So the HR example, maybe you want to provide an HR data pulse that other companies can tie into to do their own analytics. And your data is going to provide stuff like, maybe what age range within a company typically is interested in promotion versus pay raise, you know, is vacation more of a motivator, you know, things like, or is promotion more of an indicator, a motivator rather, is culture, if so, what are the pieces, what have people found successful? Like, this is a lot of valuable data, right? And I mean, I'm using a fairly trivial example in HR stuff, not to say that HR is trivial by any means, it's not, but just those are some thoughts off the top of my head. So for you folks working, you know, deep within your company and with your own people or your own customers, I'm sure you can find a lot of value in there. And a lot of that is applicable out on the data marketplace. So what techniques do we use to investigate data? This is kind of like, okay, we've talked about all the data, how it's important. We've talked about identifying it a bit and talked about what we can do with it. So where do we look? This really comes down to, you know, finding the right people, and that's both from the business and the technology side. But generally the way, you know, I've looked through it in the past, and I think that works best for me, is I start small, right? So first get an understanding of the table structure in your database, you know, and then once you do, look at key kind of indicators. Look at the system logs or the database logs and understand which tables are being used the most, right? So you've probably heard of the critical path of execution, meaning the path through in an application that if any one piece fails, then the whole thing comes to a grinding halt. Same thing with a project. If you do project management, there's a critical path that you need to follow. And if anything gets delayed on that critical path, then the whole project's delayed. With data, there's often a critical path that can be found in terms of what data structures are necessary for the day-to-day functioning, the 80% of the function of the app. And if they have problems, then the whole app comes to a grinding halt, assuming, of course, you haven't built an eventually consistent system, as I talked about before, using queues and whatnot, in which case you're going to be much more robust. But 90% of folks out there will not be using that model. So, and that's true with a lot. It's almost 100% true with legacy data. So data, so tables, yeah, look at what has a large volume of data. Look what's being used the most. Views, what views are being used. And you don't have to have a fancy tool necessarily. You can actually just go in and just find out, based on all your reports and queries and stuff, what view, is there 1 or 2 or 20 views in particular that tend to be used the most? And those are the views you might want to investigate, and that's kind of where you want to start, right? So database and application logs are a giveaway too, right? Not so much in that you want to read through all the system events, blow by blow. It's probably going to be a pretty boring read. But what you can find in database logs is a lot of the information that I discussed above. So that's another technique. Visually, you can go in and look through your reports and see what's being used. You can also do it in a bit more systematic way by going through logs and just finding out what views and tables and what stored procedures and whatnot have been used the most. And this will give you a bit of a compass towards where to start your journey, and certainly in terms of what will be most impactful, right? So popular interface components such as the reports and data grids, that can also tell you what's preferred by the user. So that's not so much the data as the user interface, right? And again, we talked about the heat maps a bit. So if you have a system, HubSpot, for instance, supports this. You can tie into your app and you can get analytics, and it will tell you who's been going to what page, where do they tend to click, stuff like that, right? So those types of things can be helpful, because if you look at those, it may lead you to certain reports that are being used. It may even lead you to more information, like a report, call it report A, tends to get run 100 times a day. Report B tends to get run 15 times a day. And so you're like, well, that's interesting, because report A and B are basically the same report, just a different information view or a different way of rendering the data. Well, that tells you something important right there. That tells you maybe that the way that data is being presented isn't of value in B where it is in A. You may also find out things like, hey, report A gets run 100 times because and it would be only run 15 times as well. But the reason it goes 100 times is because it takes too long and people cancel it and they retry, stuff like that. So you need to basically use that kind of, that's what that analytics kind of information and data gives you, is it gives you a window into what's actually going on to solve the root problems and to really drive. As I said, it's a window to the application. It really helps you understand what's going on. So integrations and export jobs, these are it's probably obvious, but this is a good place to look to, because like tables and views, they represent how people interface with the system on some level. In the case of integrations and export jobs, it's more indicative of how system to system integration happens, but it can tell you a lot about how you flow data downstream and how you pull data from upstream. And that information can really give you a lot of insights into the data itself. So once we have the data, you know, how do we look at the data? How do we assess it? This is more of a technical discussion, so I won't digress. But essentially, really just comes down to, one, looking at the access logs again, like the database logs and the application logs. And what that will tell you is, again, the frequency with which things are executed, but it will also tell you the frequency with which things fail. It will tell you things might be getting canceled because they time out in the system. And it will give you information and metrics around how that data is actually being accessed, or how the database management system, for instance, sees the data being accessed. We will also have things like explain plans. You've probably heard of. Explain plans are basically using the database to evaluate how a query will be interpreted by the database. So by using an explain plan, you can actually break down any query being done in your system, and you'll know exactly where it's going to be slow, exactly the types of resources it will be using, and that will help you understand a lot of things, in particular how to improve the performance and do query optimization, which is generally speaking what it's utilized for. So really understand how that data is being accessed, right? Understand why it's being accessed. And this is important. When we look at the data, what we really want to understand is are we building reports that go directly to the database, or are we using in-application reports and data grids, right? Are we using integrations? Are we using stored procedures to pull this data for a batch job, or is that data actually being prepped for a data warehouse or something of that nature, right? Those are key pieces that tell us the significance and importance of different data within the system. You know, if it's primarily user-based, you know, the user profile or stuff like that, then it may not be as critical for us to put resources behind that to ensure smooth operation. It might be more acceptable for failure and delays. Whereas on the other hand, if it's part of a key integration, maybe it's part of one of 4 little integrations, and all of them need to successfully run in order for the full job to complete successfully. You know, that might be something that you want to understand, and you want to make sure functions smoothly, right? And really can be a key area opportunity, really, to move that into more scalable solutions. Because often, remember, when you're on this journey of assessing the data in the application, often it's the case that you don't do everything at once. There's no big bang change. I highly recommend you don't do that. Instead, you want to parcel off, figure out a piece. So using these techniques, you can figure out a piece of your app, of your solution, if you will, that's particularly difficult, but you can figure out where the boundaries are, and you can kind of slice it off, build integrations back in, and now you can deal with that problem independently in isolation, make it more scalable and whatnot, using some of these techniques. And that's key to how to get from the monolith, if you will, to the microservice architecture. So what tools can we use to level up? You know, what can we use to help us out a bit? Well, there's a plethora of tools out there. I'm not going to try to go through all of them. It would be here a long time. Instead, what I'll do is I'll just talk about the general kind of technology stack milestones you want to hit in order to have a robust technology stack, and in order to have a chain that can help you get through this. And it really just comes down to things you probably are aware of, but cloud data warehouses are definitely a thing these days. They provide real value to organizations. They reduce the cost, and they have a significant impact overall in how you can process large quantities of data cheaply and effectively and add value. You want to look at analytics tools. So tools like Sigma and Looker, these are great tools for reporting and building out dashboards and whatnot. Don't forget ETL. So you need to be able to get the data from your databases into the data warehouse. So I've used Fivetran and Rivery, both of which are pretty good. And then we talked about the heat maps. So look at things like Mouseflow and Hotjar, and we talked about HubSpot has its own function. A lot of these tools these days, even Google has its own analytics engine, that too. So you can plug these in. So these are the tools, right? Yeah, you want your data warehouse. You want to be able to do some analytics and build dashboards off that data once it's in the data warehouse. So you want your analytics tools. You'll need to get the data there in the first place. So you'll need your ETL tool. And then finally, you'll want to have some analytics to understand the user's behaviors and really understand what's going on. So as I mentioned before, I'm CEO of Kudosi, and Kudosi is a strategic goal planning tool. So Kudosi, what we identified, and I'll go through this just as this is my last couple slides. I just want to give you a kind of a real world demo to talk a little bit about some of this stuff. But the problem that Kudosi was really trying to solve was how do we unify a company on their strategic goals to promote transparency and accountability at all levels in the organization, right? And how do we do that in such a way that promotes a positive, healthy, fun culture? Very challenging problem. The solution we came up with, and so far it's been very successful, is we have an intuitive tool called Kudosi Goals. And basically it allows you to do strategic goal planning, and it allows you to collaborate across the business so that you can align all those goals together. So you can imagine goals are hierarchical, right? You have the corporate level goals at the top, the team and department level goals that feed into those, and then finally you have individual goals that feed into those. And as you complete things at the lower level, the percentage done completes implicitly at the next level, and it just rolls up. So what you get at the end of the day is a system where people are worrying about their individual things, and Kudosi ties it all together and gives you the big picture on where the company's tracking and where you're at. And then, so how does this help? It helps by minimizing status reports and meetings and miscommunication and stuff like that, right? And it really tells you as an organization, what's coming up, what are our priorities, why am I doing this? What's the impact to the organization as a whole? So Kudosi, two examples. So one example is how can we enable better decisions going forward? So this one was really interesting for us. When we started, in beta testing, what we did is we have a hierarchical structure to our goals, right? And so everything kind of flows down, which is naturally how it would work. Your VP of sales might have a corporate level goal, increase revenue by 10%. But under him or her, you may have like marketing needs to create 1,000 more impressions, or something, or salespeople need to land, Bob, the salesperson, needs to land 10 sales, Lucy needs to land 10 sales, right? Something of that nature. So what really happened though is we didn't, initially in our heads, we thought everybody should be aligned and it should all be one party, one team, right? The team's the company. And what we found was we were looking at user data, and these are beta customers, so they're sharing the data with us and we're collaborating together. And we go through and we'd look and we'd notice that when we assess the data, all the top level goals tended, not all of them, but the majority of them tended to be more functionally delineated. They spoke to the team as opposed to being a proper objective that you're trying to achieve. And really what that came down to was the fact that in our system, we didn't have the ability to segregate by team. So the QA department, engineering department, sales department, you know, they didn't have their own buckets. And the reality is often those teams had goals that supported the overall corporate structure, but weren't necessary to pollute the overall board. So a lot of customers were using top level goals, and they'd have like, for instance, safety as the top level, a safety team, and then they'd have sub goals under there, right? So yeah, that was definitely a learning for us, and so that led to us incorporating the functionality in our app to have team boards. And now we have team boards. Each team can have their own top level goals, and that all came about from evaluating the data and understanding it. And then another example was private goals. We had cases where we noticed when we looked at, and this is a good example, sometimes the absence of something can actually say more than something being there. And so we noticed in one company, for instance, their HR department wasn't using the tool at all. And so we talked to them about that. And what it came down to was that HR had a lot of goals that they needed to achieve that were very sensitive. They couldn't share this. So the goal of Kudosi was and is full transparency within the organization. But sometimes there are goals that you shouldn't be sharing in a public sense, and sometimes there's legal ramifications to doing so. So that was a good lesson for us. Is once we discovered that, we talked to them, and we started to flesh out. Okay, well, they need to be able to have privacy. They need to be able to have goals that are locked down to a certain list of individuals and/or teams. So that was a real learning for us. And both of these things, very simple examples, I'll admit, but they both speak to the fact that goals can be, data can be a window to the application and can tell you a lot about where you're deficient or where the opportunities lie. And you just have to look for certain patterns within it, and you find that through all the tables and the views and all the things we've discussed and the techniques. And when you do that, you're going to have a much better sense of what your application can and can't do and what the opportunities are for that application. So thanks a lot for listening to my webinar. If you want to contact me, I've posted my email address up there. But yeah, I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chris. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. So does anybody have any questions you can ask here? Or maybe you can later send an email to Chris. You can contact him directly. You can mention the chat either if you have any questions.
Yeah, sure. Just if you have any questions, chris@kudosi.com, fire them over and I'll be happy to answer. Or if you have them now, no problem.
Yeah, I can send his email ID along with our contact address on the following email. Okay, thank you all for your attention and time. Thank you, Chris. It was very, very nice presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay.
See you
Okay
later.
then. Bye. See you later.